Good afternoon. So my name is Mark Bristow, and thank you for joining us for this panel. We're going to talk about a tabletop exercise that MITRE ran last December that basically simulated what domestic cyber effects with war with China might look like, and some of the things that we observed, challenges identified, and some solutioning. So we got a really great panel with me here today. So if you guys just want to introduce yourselves briefly.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe.
There we go. All right. Rob Morgus. I am a senior advisor for risk and resilience at Berkshire Hathaway Energy. My portfolio is mostly around managing strategic threats to the business. That's sometimes a euphemism for nation states, sometimes a euphemism for emerging technologies, but focused on sort of driving threat awareness and then building resilience programs off the back of that with our several energy businesses that are sprinkled throughout the US, the UK, and Canada. And before that, I spent several years at the Cyberspace Solarium Commission.
I'm Charles Goodwin. I'm the Commissioner for Emergency Management and Emergency Communications for the City of Worcester, Massachusetts. I've been working in the emergency management and communications field for about 15 years. In the city, we kind of oversee all of our critical infrastructure, both private and public critical infrastructure, as well as our emergency communication, 911 communication for central Massachusetts and a number of other communication functions within the city. And prior to that, I was in law enforcement.
I'm Tariq Habib. I work for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York. We serve every day more than 6 million customers. And my primary goal and objective there is to make sure those trains, buses, bridges, and tunnels, thousands of facilities we have, they continue to be safe and not cause disruption in services.
Good afternoon. I'm Sharla Artz. I'm the Security and Resilience Area Vice President for Xcel Energy. For those of you that are not familiar with Xcel, we don't have maybe as big of a name as Berkshire, but you didn't hear that from me. Don't tell my boss that. We are in 8 states, mostly in the Midwest: Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin. We have about 4 million electric customers, 2 million natural gas. We have nuclear generation, wind. My role for the company based here in DC is to manage our national security partnerships and then also to support our CEO who serves on the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. So really appreciate Mark bringing this panel together and for you guys including us in this discussion.
Thanks, Charlotte. And I know it's a panel, but I have 3 slides. I promise there's only 3 slides because most of you probably have no idea what exercise we're actually talking about. Oh, that's all upside down. That's super fun. Oh, no, we don't have my slides in here.
No, your slides are not there.
Okay, never mind. I don't have any slides. Yeah, clapping.
First I heard you had slides.
It's all good. So I will just talk about what the exercise is then, and then we'll go from there and kind of get into some of the questions. So who's ever participated in an exercise before? Show of hands. Basically everybody, right? Who has participated in an exercise and found it incredibly boring or not insightful? I certainly have. Who's participated in an exercise where you had at least 15 different companies or entities participating together from different perspectives? Some hands. Yeah, you guys can't. You can't vote. Less hands, right? When we do exercises, a lot of times the learning objectives of exercises are very focused on kind of specific things, oftentimes internal to our individual companies or individual sectors. We do a lot of things. I didn't introduce myself. How silly of me. So I'm Mark Bristow. I am the director of the Cyber Infrastructure Protection Innovation Center at MITRE. I really wish I could change that name. It's a lot of words. I also ran incident response at DHS, CISO, NPPD, et cetera, for 14 years with some colleagues here in the room. So I come from the perspective of I used to chase our national adversaries around our infrastructure. And in my time in government, I participated in a lot of exercises too. And a lot of them, honestly, were very focused on very governmenty things that were not particularly useful, even though they talked about critical infrastructure as being part of the exercise. but I wouldn't see any of these folks at my exercises, right? We were never getting together the right kind of group of people to really see what the types of effects from non-kinetic effects against our infrastructure would look like at scale, right? And what that looks like nationwide. And so at MITRE, we have these things, they're called long-term measures that basically are 3-year programs to address particular issues that MITRE thinks we should take a look at. And one of those was critical infrastructure resiliency. And Charles Clancy, my senior vice president, kind of gave me the task of running this exercise and its subsequent activities to look at the intersections between our risk. Because a lot of us have risk management plans that are very focused on our company, or maybe you have some integrated plans for your sector, but we're not really looking at that risk across the entire fabric. And even if we are in some infrastructure verticals like the tri-sector, I know does a lot of coordination, we don't have people like Charles in that equation, right? There's a group that always gets left out of this, and that's the emergency managers of the world. And let me tell you, when you're looking at effects against critical infrastructure, and I think so some of the opening remarks, and Bryson talked about it in his interview with Nick, and we're really talking about life safety issues here. And yes, on the day-to-day basis, and I think it was in Joe's talk, Volt Typhoon is talked about a lot, right? And that's kind of the center of the exercises scenario. But like, Volt Typhoon is not killing people every day. That is not happening today, right? But that's what they mean to do, right? And so if we're not looking at this as not only a cyber problem, but also the all hazards incident response, and I mean that in a FEMA NIMS kind of way, we're not addressing the whole challenge, right? Because at some point it stops being a computer problem and starts being a humanitarian problem. And so we need to have a complete compendium of different infrastructure sectors and perspectives to include our emergency managers to effectively see how that will play out. So if I have my slides, what it would say was you can't exercise the entire universe all at once, right? So we picked 5 sectors and 5 cities to do our exercise. So we did electric power, we did natural gas pipelines, we did rail, we did IT, and we did communications. Those are the 5 sectors we chose. And then we did 5 cities. We did the greater Boston area. We did New York City. We did Hampton Roads, Virginia. We did Chicago, and we did Colorado, right? So there's five sectors, 5 cities, all of represented here by, now we couldn't have everybody on the panel, but we brought all the different infrastructure providers together to MITRE to do a 2-day exercise that was held at the secret level. So it was a classified exercise. Some of our people had to get 1-day read-ins to get read into the secret material. And we basically ran through what China will do to us in the event of like a Taiwan Strait scenario. And so the exercise kind of rolled out in 4 phases. The first phase was sort of nuisance attacks. So things like, the first thing we did was we killed access to the cloud. Azure was gone, Zoom was gone. Right? Your communications infrastructure, basically not available to you or not trustworthy, right? That was kind of in phase 1. We sort of caused that nuisance level impacts. We overwhelmed the nation's ability to respond to cyber incidents in the nuisance phase when we did it at that scale. Because again, a lot of these exercises, they focus on a particular region. They don't, and we have concepts about how we'll get support from other regions. But when everyone's under attack, as I like to say, when the hurricane is everywhere, it breaks some of our mutual aid kind of concepts that we use to manage consequences today. And so just in that first phase with those nuisance attacks, we managed to overwhelm our capacity to respond. In phase 2, that's where they actually start to do destructive attacks, right? So we start to see intentional disruption of control systems environments for various effects. We start to see things going after societal messaging and societal panic, which is a goal of the adversary, and start to really see that kind of roll from it be a cyber problem to now it's more of that, how do we actually manage this disaster type of problem? Phase 3 was where the destructive attacks went kind of for the jugular, as it were. So it was staged 15 days after the actual invasion of Taiwan, where we would expect to see basically those destructive attacks start to happen at scale across the entire country. And then phase 4 was 45 days after the start of the war. where we tried to reconstitute our critical infrastructure. That 45 days piece is actually kind of important because a lot of people that have good planning horizons often do that for 30-day plans, but it will take a little bit longer than 30 days to kind of restart multiple critical infrastructure sectors across the nation. And so we need to start thinking about this a little bit differently and extending our kind of planning time horizons about how we actually address this particular challenge. So that was the exercise sort of in a really quick nutshell off the top of my head. But you didn't really want to talk and hear from me, right? Really, I think it's more important to hear kind of reflections of the exercise from, the asset owner operators, the people that, kind of got this thrown at you. Maybe it wasn't very fun, but at least, kind of emulating some of the things that we sort of expect from our adversary. So I want to start the Q&A kind of part here with just a quick kind of rapid fire question down the line about, we experienced a lot of interesting things during the exercise. We focused on where we had codependencies between sectors, right? Because again, those individual emergency plans tend to be pretty good, but how do we actually impact our neighbors is a piece that isn't really well addressed. So what was the biggest surprise? And Rob, you're next to me, so I'm starting with you. What was the biggest surprise from the exercise that you found, and how's it changed your way of thinking or your planning kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that there were any huge surprises. But the exercise on its own and some of the takeaways, I think, have provided us with some anecdotes, some evidence to point to have some important internal conversations about the ways that we operate. I think about it sort of at a couple of different levels. There were insights that I took away for our operations. There were also insights that I took away for the way that we coordinate at a national level. On the sort of operational side, I think one of the things, and this was borne out in speaking with some of our peers, both in the utility space and elsewhere, is just how codependent the electric sector in particular and the telecommunications sector are. And just how important having real-time comms and just how much most electric companies rely on commercial networks is for maintaining the electricity, and just how much our sort of data center and telco friends and partners rely on us to maintain their networks as well. So that was one big takeaway. And then the other is that we still have not cracked the code on national level crisis response, especially in response to a cyber attack. We have UCGs and CRGs, and we spin things up in the White House, but the actual impacted and potentially sort of organizations that can then impact back on the problem generally aren't at the table, and we don't have good mechanisms to bring them in on a regular basis or to plan even to bring them in. So briefly, I'd say those were sort of two of the biggest takeaways. I think there's more you can unpack in both of those though.
Charles? No, it's Charles, not Sharla.
Oh, okay. So I don't think I had any big surprises either. I came into it thinking that if we weren't failing at something, then this was kind of a waste of an exercise. And thankfully we failed at a lot of things. So at least I took a lot out of that, but that was an important thing to really help us look at what we needed to do next. But one of the things that really stuck with me walking out of the exercise was really the interdependencies between public and private partnerships and how we need to rely on one another to bring some of that critical infrastructure back, and how they depend on each other. And then going a step further to really thinking about, if you have an emergency plan in place or an action in place on how to restore that critical infrastructure, what is that plan dependent on? So my example, as I've talked to a lot of local and state leaders up in Massachusetts, has been, we have a level 1 trauma center. It runs, on electricity, power goes out. Their backup plan is a generator that runs on diesel fuel. What happens if they can't get access to diesel fuel? And then how does that affect other pieces of infrastructure in the city? So police, fire, and EMS response now has to divert. They may not be able to bring patients locally, so that now adds time onto a response in the area. We now may have to move patients out of there. And in order to coordinate some of that, we need communications. And if the communications has gone out by then we have to find a new way to communicate. And then we need access to, transportation to bring them to another location, which, to be honest, even in a smaller state with a lot of access to those items, if this is, affecting the city of Worcester, it's affecting every community around us. We're all somehow interconnected, which means all of that mutual aid is really getting stretched thin, and it's generally already stretched thin. So it's going to kind of compound over time and cause even worse problems that we'll have to try to figure out how to overcome. So really it brought back for me to start thinking on a local level, how do we start thinking beyond, our first set of plans? And, if our first set of responses to restore infrastructure are going to fail because they're dependent on something else, we need to go a few steps further out.
So first, a complaint to MITRE. So we attended this, secret level exercise. We were told not to say anything. And 3 months later, there was a Netflix movie called 0 Day. So I thought that maybe MITRE sold part of the plan to everybody.
Look, we're getting cuts, man. We got to make money somehow, all right?
So I didn't get any. I participated in that exercise. So that's part one. I think what was interesting about that exercise, I participated on what happened in New York and all the stakeholders and players that were in that meeting. The interesting part was that I know how transportation sector is, how they behave, and what are their practices. And I think this was the surprising part, that the telecommunication sector, the power sector, pipeline, they essentially have the same behaviors in a way when it comes to incident response side of it. One is, I think, that was evident is the overconfidence. That if they have this, meaning all sectors have this overconfidence, they are very resilient and they can recover from any incident and provide services. So that was one thing that stood out. The second thing was, I think there is a denial to some extent, because most of the critical infrastructure entities haven't really seen a large scale incident. So they can't imagine that something like what happened in Spain and Portugal, that was not a cyber incident, hopefully, can happen here, and how we're going to respond. And the last part was, in my case, meaning transportation and other sectors as well, it seems like that everybody was ready for day one plan, that what would they do? They were already including, the transportation sector, that what happens with my sector, right? I mean, it will just impact me. All my plans do not go over the interdependencies. That look, what if something goes on? I mean, Mark's word, 45 days. It's unimaginable for us that, look, we are going to develop a plan. So this is what primarily were the main takeaways. And now we're working within, our various entities and agencies that we have at the MTA to develop a plan that goes beyond, 1 day.
So my surprise, maybe it wasn't a surprise, but is a little counter to what you just said, which is the benefit of the exercise. And I really want to thank MITRE for doing and pulling off such a large event that included such, diverse perspectives, and including Colorado in that, was that there were a lot of moments where it was very clear from the participants where they looked and they were like, oh, wait, you're not starting from scratch one, like square one. You've actually thought about this before. That's why you're building your own private LTE network to compensate for those commercial dependencies. Oh, wait, you've thought about how your crews might need protection after a 2-week power outage, doing inspection of lines, because that's what you have to do before you can put the power back on. That is really important for us to remember, that my emergency manager friends have a lot of experience, that my telecom sector friends have thought about this and have expertise that they can bring to the table. Because if we think that we're starting from square one and we're trying to prepare for this 2027 date, we are doing ourselves a disservice. We need to build upon the expertise and the thinking and the planning that has already been there, learn from each other, fill in the gaps, right? And really build on that versus starting from square one, or we're never going to be as prepared, not that we will, by that date that we're all thinking about. So I think that was probably one of my biggest surprises. And I experience it a lot in the interaction that we do, right? I remember we are part of a group of 5 or so utilities that support a really important defense facility. And we've had conversations with them, and we've been very appreciative of the outreach that they've done to us to kind of make us aware of the threat and bring us into the fold. We know about the threat. We've known about it for a long time. And I remember one of the interactions that we had, one of the government officials, I was explaining to them how we do a lot of information sharing in our sector, right? And how they can utilize that, how we can work together to help them learn from us. And one of the individuals was like, what is this EISAC that you speak of? And I was like, the Electricity Sector Information Sharing and Analysis Center that's been around for 25 years, right? So I just highlight that because we have a lot of opportunity to build, not from the ground floor, but maybe on the 4th floor, maybe.
Second or third floor.
Second or third, we'll go second or third.
No, I think, you know, I asked you all to be here because you represent some of the more mature thinking. I think that there were some participants at the exercise, and I failed to mention, we had in total about 200 participants from 70 different organizations in this exercise. So it was a pretty scaled activity, right? I can't have all those represented here on stage, but you know, I think that there were definitely some surprises to many of the participants who hadn't really thought through this along 2 axes. The first one was mentioned, which was the duration, right? A lot of cyber incidents are relatively short in duration, right? You know, especially things like ransomware. Well, they can take a really long time to recover if you don't have a plan, but you know, a lot of cyber stuff is relatively short in duration. And when we look at effects or actual exhibited effects against critical infrastructure, you don't see a lot of examples where that lasted very long, right? I think the preeminent one, you know, the Ukraine 2015 attack, right, was recovered within 4 hours, right? That's not a long duration event, but that duration has impact in how you actually manage the incident. The other thing that I think was an axis that I observed as something that the participants weren't thinking all the way through, and you've all mentioned it, is comms, right? So many of our plans assume that when we have some type of incident like this, that we can actually talk to each other to coordinate. And I think what the basis of the exercise, I was having this conversation in the hallway with someone, was effectively Salt Typhoon. Before Salt Typhoon, we designed this scenario before that all came out, right? If you're not tracking Salt Typhoon, this is, you know, Chinese government actors who have gotten a lot of access and presence in core communications infrastructure in the United States. Basically, with that access, they can mess with our communications infrastructure, right? They can deny it, they can inject invalid communications, right? They can make us not trust our primary communications pathways. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was that after we started messing with the comms infrastructure, the only people who had a reliable way that they knew would work to talk to each other was the comms people. They had a whole plan on how they were going to continue to coordinate and communicate. There was pockets of that happening elsewhere, but they were relatively well ordered. But the challenge that they had was, as the comms infrastructure came under attack and more attack, they started to basically protect their networks by shedding subscribers, turning off wireless networks, turning off MPLS circuits. They didn't have a good way to decide which ones to turn off. So as their ability to actually deliver services to their entire stakeholder base kept getting reduced, they didn't have a predefined plan on like who stays on. Now they do have some prioritization things for restoration. There's a couple of legal frameworks that do that for comms, but even those didn't really apply in this scenario because you're not servicing kind of the entire infrastructure all at once. And so the prioritization, and anyone can pop in. We don't have to do the down the line thing. I hate it when panelists do that. That doesn't mean you can't speak first if you really want to. I know you got thoughts on this topic, but how are you guys looking at when you don't have all the electrons to push or you don't have all the trains to move? How are you prioritizing who gets it and who doesn't? And how are you coordinating that with your peers?
We can't without some form of support, whether it is local, state, or federal, to provide us with guidance on what actually matters. Because one of the insights that didn't come up, but I think was a big one for me from this exercise, is when the hurricane is everywhere, you're not going to save everything, period. It's not happening. Don't care if you're a telco, your scenario, or an electric company. You're not going to be able to run. If we lose our comms, we cannot run our whole system. Point blank, right? And at that point, it's not really a cyber problem. It's an operations problem. And it's a people problem. And we can surge and we can do manual operations in certain corridors, but we need to know where we need to plan to do that. And we don't have, there's some philosophical piece to this where maybe we are not the right people to make that call, right? Because if we are the ones who are making that call, it's largely going to be driven by bottom line, and that may not always align with national security needs or health and safety needs or national economic needs, right? When I think about this problem and I think about the scenario that we're talking about, you kind of create your own Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And I think at the top of the list, you have protecting sort of freedom of decision from a national decision-making perspective, from a national security perspective, more sort of concretely, right? So you start with what do we need to protect and surge to in order to maintain force mobilization and the like, right? Okay, so that is a geographically constrained question. Where do we actually need to focus? All right, and if we start with that force mobilization question, what other sorts of infrastructures do we need to surge to these locations to then protect the economic functions, which in this day and age is a euphemism for the large data centers and the sort of health and safety concerns, right? And how do you message, how do you make sure that you build sort of a national mindset and preparedness around that so that if I don't live in one of those places, but I know that I need to go have electricity and comms are dark and the skies are dark, I know where I potentially need to try to go, right? It feels out there, it feels almost prepperish. But at this point, when we're talking about a major nation state coming after our infrastructure, that's what we're in, right?
Just to add to that, I think what on a local level, we're able to provide information, but I think even on a local government level, we're still looking to state and federal for support. But one of the best things we can do on the local level is work with those organizations to identify critical infrastructure in those communities. And it's something we do with our local power and gas companies now, because we know on a larger scale in the community, which are utilized more, which are more important, which have different functions and purposes, rather than just going by names on a list. Here's all the medical centers, and everybody wants to qualify as a medical center when the power is coming back on, but that might change.
You have that downstream, cross-stream view that we in an individual sector and individual function do not have, right?
And it's probably from a lot of bad things happening over time, gas explosions, major power outages, so on and so forth. I can quite literally predict any time that it rains 2 inches or more in the city of Worcester, I will lose power in certain areas, and I know which areas will flood just because of where the power lines are already underground, and we know that the infrastructure is older. Quite literally on a local scale, our water and sewer infrastructure was installed in 1895. And we're just having discussions now on replacing that. So if you could imagine, first, it's not large enough for, it was built for a community that wasn't 200,000+ residents. And it's falling apart on a daily basis. But that's all of the infrastructure in some of these communities that you build it and then you move on to the next project. I'm fortunate enough that I work for a city that won't be so affected by a lot of these incidents because we built all of our stuff on DOS. So I don't have to worry about it so much. But eventually someday we'll get to a point where maybe we advance to the 21st century and we start using real technology. But we actually do, I joke, but we actually do have our payroll system that we're piecing together because no one wants to support it until we finally move on to the next thing because it is just that old. But we have a lot of work to do, and that's really something that, has been shown by doing this exercise.
I will say earlier when the congressman mentioned, Windows 95, and I was like, oh, they modernized.
We've had exercises, right? Piggybacking off of Rob, but I think it's important where we talked about ruthless prioritization, right? Am I going to be serving for life safety at the hospital, or am I going to be serving the critical defense facility? And as long as we have those conversations in advance and that awareness, right, then my local planners can start planning where they're going to evacuate people to, right? We can start thinking about the infrastructure, the resilience that's needed to do both, right? But that is a more holistic picture than just looking at it from the lens of a cyber attack. It's that planning for, say, pandemic or really national level kind of natural disasters that are going to help us then do that recovery and response. And we just haven't had those conversations about who will make those decisions so that we can start doing the planning now. I'm not going to steal what I love that you talk about, Rob, about the importance of planning, but sometimes the best way to dodge the ball is not to dodge, right? You duck, and you've done it because you've got two substations that you can rely on, and they've got different types of equipment, technology platforms, so that you can do the recovery in that scenario.
And I think what's beautiful about the planning focus and the preparedness focus is that security generally exists in a pretty capital constrained environment. I think all of us in this room who are security professionals can agree to that. In utilities, we have compounding regulatory constraints that make it difficult for us to sort of put capital outlay out there to drive down risk. But planning is an incredibly cost-effective exercise, right? It's cheap to do, and it gets your people ready to operate through whatever the disruption ends up being.
One to add. One, I still feel I'm in denial. To really, from a sector-specific point of view, it's hard for us to imagine cyber warfare, its larger impact, that what we are going to do. But one thing that's very clear, but I think the emphasis on planning and communication, that's the part I think is very difficult. We had the exercise, the way we operate. We are a state entity or city entity. There are emergency services. There are federal entities. There are private sector partners that are part of this whole thing. So as we were going through this exercise back then, it was also very clear that everyone knows what they're supposed to do, and not everyone knows across that what everyone else is doing, that what's the expectation. So, since the exercise, that was one takeaway, and, we've been trying to work through the state and also partner with the New York City emergency management people and others to see if we can have our own tabletop exercises, develop processes, and make sure that the communication channels are open. Everyone knows who to go to and what to expect in case of a larger event like cyber warfare.
And I'll just add that anybody that needs to work with their local emergency management director, we like to tell people that we're the only legally required position in every community ever since the Civil Defense Act of 1950. Every local community by law has to have an identified emergency manager, whether it be an actual position or police or fire chief, town administrator. Somebody has those responsibilities in the community. So there's going to be somebody to reach out to regardless of where you are in the country.
So getting off talking points now, sorry, just riffing on some of the things that you were all saying about planning and how, to your point, it's so cheap. It doesn't always feel that way when you're doing it, but like in truth, it really is a lot cheaper than the effects. But you've all sort of touched on the fact that that isn't happening cross-organizationally or cross-sector or cross-jurisdictionally right now at the scale it needs to meet this threat. Why not? What's the impediment?
I would think that on some level, and my private partners here, correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes we don't share well, especially information-wise. Some people, if you're a private entity versus a local entity, sometimes you don't want to necessarily share some of those insider things. And the same goes for local government and state government. Sometimes we don't like to share our information out, or we're not even that very good at it. So we don't always get the right opportunities to sit down and do the planning the way it needs to get done.
Sectors are like a social construct, man. No, but
you say that wearing,
I know.
Well coordinated clothing here. That's, I don't know.
So, but in all reality, I think we fall into a rut when we start thinking along sector lines. And I think that thinking along sector lines actually at this stage, thinking about this scenario specifically, does more harm than good. Because it's an impediment to the planning that you're talking about, where you've got that 30,000 foot view and you understand the dependencies, right? And I think when you look at individual sectors, if they operated in bubbles, in many cases, you do potentially have resilience, but we do not do a good job of creating cross-sector awareness and then planning across sectors, right? We have sector-specific exercises, like we are guilty of this in the energy sector as much as anyone, right? Where we have sector-specific exercise and we say, all right, yep, we're good. As a sector, we're good. But then you introduce telco dependencies specifically, or natural gas in many cases, right? I mean, one of the things that we don't maybe talk about as much as we should is just how dependent the grid is on natural gas pipelines. Moving to a large portion of our generation is natural gas generation today still. You go up to Canada and it's even crazier, the dependency, right? We don't do a good job of breaking those sector barriers down. I think there have been instances where the federal government has tried to do some of that, and I don't know how successful those efforts have been. And I think one of the challenges that we face is that we have organized our public-private partnership around the concept of sectors. And that is not the most effective way to ruthlessly prioritize, to understand what the actual impacts will be of disruptions, especially when the hurricane's everywhere all at once.
Charlie, you look like you want to jump in. Go.
No, Rob is, absolutely spot on, right? In terms of thinking it just from the sector specific perspective. It goes to that holistic perspective on resilience that we need to be thinking about. And now that because I was thinking back about your psychedelic reference, where I was going with this, now I do remember, sorry, is we need to get to a place where we're doing like what we did with the exercise in December, where it's much more tactical, functional than just theoretical. A lot of the exercises we have at the scale that we like to do them, say in the electric sector, it's GridX. I know others, DOE has, our sector risk management agency has a lot of exercises. Even some of the wargaming stuff we've done with our Department of Defense friends, it's very high level, right? It doesn't get to that level of this node here is more important than this node here. So where should we pre-position trucks to transport people or have the radios there that are charged and ready to go in that event, right? And one of the things that we took away as a company from the December exercise and a couple of other interactions that we've had lately is this is not we can't keep talking about these things. We can't keep admiring the problem. We actually have to sit down and map this out and think about it to then incorporate into our resilience plans, because other folks have heard me say this, a lot of that resilience need is long lead planning and capital intensive. You can't get it done overnight. So we're trying to move to more of the things like MITRE and the exercise really pointed out of how would you protect crews that are out in the field after 2 weeks? I bring that up a lot because we had an incident in Colorado where we have to walk the line, hundreds of miles of line to make sure that when you go and re-energize, people don't die, right? And the guys that were doing that to get the power on more quickly were being constantly harassed and threatened in the field because people were angry about their power going out, or they were just angry in general. I don't know, right? But that delayed restoration of service because we have to keep those men and women safe, right? So that knowing in advance how we're going to collaborate collectively to protect the telecom crews and the electric crews and maybe even the oil and natural gas line workers, right? So that we can get the services that are interdependent on each other back up and running more quickly. Those are the conversations we need to be having at the level that you guys really introduced in December.
And transportation.
And transportation, thank you. Yes.
And you forgot to add in that all of this bad stuff happened in December. So it was probably snowing and it was cold and windy and a terrible time to go out and fix anything.
Yeah, I believe we actually had bombogenesis, which was a word I had to learn how to pronounce, was part of the exercise, which had different levels of effect. I'll tell you, the Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach area was like, yeah, it's a little cold. It's like in the 60s for us, right? No big deal. But Colorado had some serious impacts from the weather exacerbating the cyber effects against the infrastructure, right? Because now, they were talking about mass casualty events and I think had a new appreciation for the reliance on natural gas for a variety of different things that came out of that geographic constraint, right? And I think that's, kind of one of the challenges here is that, we in the cyber world, we tend to look at this as a computer problem, right? But in reality, at the end of the day, it ends up being a people problem. Right. And I think, one thing that the exercise did is we started the whole exercise in move one in sector orientation. So we had the power people together, the comms people, the rail people, the emergency managers, who I think were probably confused as to why they were there in the very first part of the exercise, to be completely honest, and that's okay. But they got hyper local really fast, right? Every disaster is local, right? That's how this all works. And especially when communication goes out, that becomes even more critical. And I saw the emergency managers through the evolution of the exercise sit more forward in their chairs as that was going forward, because this started to become more routinized from a disaster management type of feel to it than a cyber attack type of feel. But again, we don't practice that, right? And we don't practice the human element of this too. Like you both brought up, is like there's a physical safety perspective, right? These line workers have to show up to work and actually have protection and eat, right? And we're not thinking about that type of plan today, right? Our response plan for this is, actually, I don't really know what our response plan for this is. I think the exercise highlighted that. But
I'm on vacation that week.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm going to direct this one at you, Charles, specifically. Like, for the city of Worcester, how would you like to see this go? As an emergency manager and with the statutory responsibility of the only, required position in the city, what would you like to have in order to stop this from happening?
Hopefully not gray hair at the end, but I doubt that would happen. I think.
Can hold on. I don't think that's the right question.
Okay.
Because I don't think your job is to stop it from happening.
There. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Rob.
What do I need?
Happens when I vamp.
What do you need to muddle through?
Yeah. Thank you, Rob.
And I think muddling through, I think one of the interesting things, from a local emergency management perspective that came out of this was, thinking more broadly than local. So if we needed, one of the representatives that was there was the Coast Guard, and we were talking about, if that loss of communications happened, some of the fuel, the diesel fuel that we need in New England and Massachusetts would come in by ship, which wouldn't be able to come in. So how else would we be able to get it up there? And the natural gas that we use in Massachusetts comes down from Canada. Now, what happens if Canada just shuts everything down? They are not, we can't communicate with them. They don't want to work with us because of everything going on. How else do we plan out of there? And we're going to feel almost like we're on an island up there, and it's difficult enough to get certain things going up there. But we have large amounts of community that we have to try to deal with, especially on a human factor like health safety. 200,000 plus residents. It's December, it's snowing, it's cold. Now we have no natural gas, no electricity. That means no heat. How are we sheltering them? And if we bring them somewhere, we don't have the power to even shelter at local schools or big facilities, because even with that, those generators are either running on diesel fuel or natural gas, both that we found we weren't going to be able to get for a while. So how would we deal with this? And really, we took a step back going, well, first, this is going to be a bad day, bad week, bad month, bad 45 plus days. But we really are looking at our plans holistically and trying to figure out where can we make those changes. And I think one thing that, it's something so small but stuck with me from the end was, don't expect somebody to come in and help make those connections cross sector. When the bad thing happens on day one, a ferry's not coming in going, here's the list of all the different people and all these different companies and organizations and sectors that you're going to need to contact and work with. You need to make those connections ahead of time. And you need to frequently work on those connections, because we all know that, names and bodies change company to company, sector to sector quite frequently. So, who I know right now, a year from now, may not even be there. And if I have no good contact, how do I work with somebody from that sector to try to restore electricity, power, gas, water, whatever it is? And then, going back to your comment on trying to protect the workers that are out there, we need to have that collaboration so we can work with our local and state law enforcement to provide protection and make sure that we have enough people that are on. When bad things happen, we're generally on local and state government really good about telling everybody, sorry, no vacations, you're all coming to work today. But that can only last for so long, before we start losing people, or they start really thinking, I'm coming to work every day, but I should be at home trying to help deal with my family. So we need to have some plans in place and be able to work to provide the support for you, because you can't restore things without that support, and we can't help the community without those restorations. So we have to really work together on that.
I'm hearing my emergency management friends are important to this conversation. Maybe we should get to know
a little bit. Yeah.
So I'll kind of ask one teed up question, and then we can turn it over to the audience for audience questions. But I'll have you react to this first, Tariq. There was a lot of bad that came out of this exercise. Okay. And we sort of knew that when we started, but there were bastions of hope that came out of this exercise. One of the things that gave me hope was actually rail, because, I know MTA, maybe this doesn't apply as much for your system, but a lot of like freight rail, et cetera, can start running like it's the 1950s again without too much effort. Right? There's maybe not as efficient, maybe not as effective, but there's things that rail actually became a potential ray of hope here. In how do we actually get goods moving? How do we get communications? How do we restart? Right? So, can you react to that, and then tell me what gave you hope out of the exercise?
Don't know if I had any hopes. I waited for a few calls for some, sector participants that maybe our ConEd or PSCG would call. Hey, look, we want to work with the MTA, and so that you know where you stand in your prioritization. So ultimately, I think the lesson learned was that, look, don't wait for MITRE, don't wait for federal government, don't wait for state government, just like everyone is saying, and you're saying, that, look, you got to do this on your own, right? Bring the sectors together. And try to figure out how that happens. So that is very true, that rails can always run. And they could be, although they would be very slow and very few. So, for instance, in MTA's case, I just wanted to give you an example. In 2017, New York City Comptroller's Office did a study. And so MTA, if you're in New York, the trains generally run every few minutes. So our on-time performance metric is every 5 minutes. The train is within 5 minutes, we're good. We're performing at 100% performance metric there. So they said that, look, if your train is running 10 minutes late, your impact to the New York State or New York City economy that day is over $200 million. If train is running every 20 minutes late, and this is in 2017, the impact to New York City that day is $389 million. And it does not account for that, how people get to work and, they're taking, they're missing their flights or, there are many other impacts, but the productivity impacts are that high. And what we have seen that anytime, obviously we do have disruptions, that something happens within the city, suddenly thousands and thousands of people are converging to the same locations. It has a larger impact, right, from a physical harm perspective and in general. And so ultimately, MTA also has 6,000 buses, 6,000 plus buses, I should say. So we are able to transport those people. So instead of getting maybe, within 40 minutes home that night, you will get home maybe 4 hours later, right? It gets same is true for the freight trains that they can run, and MTA can run, right? I mean, they always say, look, we'll have either walkie-talkie or flags and, people would be there. But again, the question is, can you sustain that model both for the freight rail or for the public transportation type of service? Can you sustain that model for a very long period of time when actual cyber warfare is going on, right? I mean, under normal circumstances, maybe there was an electrical outage, and that's causing it, people can do it. But if it is really serious, where there are other life safety issues or, you have to be with your family, I think it becomes very, very difficult to run even freight rail at a longer intervals.
Not exactly hopeful, but okay.
I will say a hopeful is that, there are a lot of smart people in here. There's a lot of people that have been doing industrial control system cybersecurity for a really long time. What I will say on the hopeful piece is that there wasn't a question that this could happen, right? There was a commitment to this could very well happen, and what are we going to do about it? Now, it's a lot of work that we have to do. There's a lot of relationship building that needs a lot of care and feeding because there is constant turnover and constant unawareness of how the electric grid works and all the pieces of the puzzle that go into making that reliable. But I have executives, when I talk to them about this problem set, they don't need a classified briefing to justify the investments, right? They get it. China's bad, right? They want to know more specific information so that we can do that cost-effective planning that Rob was talking about. So for me, that was hopeful. We weren't starting from a place like this would never happen. That's a crazy talk. At least in the conversations I was involved in, we were all rowing in a direction of, yeah, this could happen.
One of my favorite takeaways was one of the participants said, we were prepared for a cyber attack, not cyber war. And after the exercise, they at least knew what they needed to do to get ready for cyber war. Other hopeful positives that came out of it.
I found that it's very easy to motivate people by telling them TikTok would be gone. So that'll keep people working. The harder you work, the more TikTok will hang around. And I think hopeful at the end of the day, I mean, from the emergency management side, I think we were like, come on, what else are you going to throw at us? And then eventually we were like, we don't actually do computers. We'll plan for this, but somebody else has to do the rest of it. I think coming out of the exercise, one of the things that really provided hope for me was just seeing everybody in that room, because on a local state scale, we've tried to do some of this before and you don't get those same players in the room. So that experience was good to see the commitment from all the different sectors, different large organizations, especially, coming from Massachusetts, having the greater Boston area represented up there. Each part of the country is going to have unique challenges. So, as we worked through at the start of it with our sector specific, it was interesting hearing some of those local challenges or regional challenges based off geography, but then pulling our geographies together, it was really nice to hear information coming from all the different sectors from that geography and just how we might be able to find a way to work through this. And I didn't leave thinking, well, that's it. We're never going to be able to deal with this. It was more hopeful of, hey, we've got people that are committed, and I've never seen this many sectors in the same room at the same time, which was, probably the most positive thing we had.
I'm going to go to the audience questions next. So start working up your nerve. What made you?
Charlie, I think it's more than folks are committed and understand, but there are actually pockets of excellence out there. So, Sharla made the point earlier, we're not starting from square one or building from base up, and that's definitely true. And, the energy sector has pockets of excellence. The transpo folks do. I think a lot of emergency management does. You look across the board. The question then is, how do we knit these things together? And, the simple fact that conversation is rising up the agenda is, I think, one of the most important takeaways. And in addition to the pockets of excellence, the fact that we are having this conversation more intentionally gives me hope as well, because we don't have that much time.
Don't. So, audience questions. We have a roving mic, I think. Maybe. Oh, we're using one of those. Great.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. So I had a two-part question. First, we all agree, obviously, this is very important and needs to happen soon. How confident do you each feel that we can get there in time? And two, I've heard a lot of questions come versus solutions that are actually implementation and execution based so far. And maybe that's part of this panel, is to kind of surface that. But I feel like this room is already aware of those things, right? Especially because there are OT people here. I actually don't know how many people here are on the OT side as engineers from okay, so first of all, I think that's awesome. We need more engineers on the OT side at these things, because the secure by design element of it, you guys being the ones that drive it, that's extremely important in all these. This isn't just, a one-way conversation of cybersecurity and how can we prepare for what's coming, but it's also things we need to do so that we don't continue to grow our attack surface further, coming from the engineering side. So I would love to hear some feedback on that. Sorry, I know I'm asking a few questions, so thank you.
So I'll give you one solution to just give the panel members a second to think. Find out who your local emergency manager is and call them. Because one of my takeaways from the exercise, and I helped design it, so I was sort of hoping for this, is that the emergency managers, when we get into these situations, sort of know what to do. Right? The cyber people, when the computers stop working, sort of stop knowing what to do. And that's sort of where the emergency managers anyway, who's a CERT team member? And I don't mean computer emergency response team. Anybody a green hatter in here other than me? Okay, so go sign up, cert.gov.
They may or may not know what that even means.
But that was part of the test, is if they don't know what it means. Yeah. So it's the Community Emergency Response Team, CERT. They wear green hats, right? But the emergency management kind of cadre practices for these types of to mitigate the impacts. And so I was glad to see that the emergency managers kind of started standing up in their regions, in some cases in interesting ways, like Colorado decided that they weren't going to play with the rest of the United States anymore. But there's positive there. So if you have one takeaway from this, that you can get started by talking to Charlie and his ilk, because they are going to be critical in your community to resolving this issue. Because to your point, yes, I think we can get there.
Yeah, so solutions, right? The challenge in the context of this room is that it's not actually a cyber problem. So the solutions are not cyber solutions. So the solution is, how do you operate without, right? And that's the question that we've started asking. It's an operational problem. We've started asking all of our operators, what is your most critical system? Okay, how do you operate without it? And most of the time it's crickets and no one has an answer. So building plans to do that is a big part of the solution, because, and this may get me in trouble, but I don't think we're preventing this. If the adversary is persistent enough, I don't think we're preventing this, regardless of how good we are at defense. So the question then becomes, how do we muddle through? And that's not a cyber question. That is a systems question. There's an engineering component to it for sure, because you need to start thinking about how you engineer your systems away from cyber dependency. But it's not what new widget or technology do we need to put in place to prevent, because that's just not a realistic objective at this point.
I'd agree. I 100%. It's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. And, you know, from a government side, you know, from a municipal, local, state government side, are we prepared for it? No. Are we going to be prepared for it? In some pockets, but not holistically across the board. There's just, you know, there's too many interdependencies, just, you know, between different communities and how different organizations operate. But, you know, some of the solutions that we work on the local level, just like Mark said, the CERT team is our community emergency response team. And that came out of the idea behind, if we had a large scale disaster, we know we don't have enough police, fire, EMS to respond and help people. So what do we do next? We have to look at our community, and those that want to stand up, we can help train and call on them when something bad happens and they're prepared to help their neighbor, you know, and be able to try to help out when we can. And I think holistically that could be brought across the board, not just on a community level for a disaster, but, you know, we start working with different organizations on how can we support one another in that same way to try to recover from, you know, a disaster like this, and, you know, try to keep the community safe and then, you know, hopefully mitigate some of it in the future.
Like,
I want to add this, that it's partly a cyber issue, resilience, because here we are talking about cyber warfare. Hopefully it's not actual bombs. These are virtual attempts. So when it comes to our critical infrastructure in general, I think you mentioned DOS. So in reality, obviously our infrastructure needs investment. That's number one. But even if somebody gives us the money, the solutions do not exist that can withstand and delay and stop these type of attacks. So today it's, you know, very soft inside within the OT environments. If you can cross the fence or, you know, bypass some rudimentary controls. So really there is the solution, really part of the solution is, I mean, overall we talk about resiliency. We want to make sure systems can run, but from cyber perspective, to avoid these virtual type of attempts, wars, bombs, whatever we want to call them, there is a need for actual solutions from the vendor community. I know within the transportation sector, you won't find many, or, you know, let's say there aren't any vendors or partners out there who understand what are the true issues within the operational technology environment, and how do we change, let's say, a default password to a normal password, you know, within that environment easily without, you know, shutting down that system or making it very hard for the operators. So ultimately, you know, my response is that we need to make sure that they are, you know, vendor community has to come forward, understand the OT environment, and bring some solutions that are more practical and work in our environments so we can defend against these type of attacks.
other questions?
Yeah, okay. It went to color mode and I was like, oh, can I not ask my question now? Thank you for a very good discussion. I'm glad that this happened. When I worked for the city of New York at New York City Cyber Command, we tried to put together something like this, at least think through it a bit. And it's incredible work that you've done. I just finished doing some research on using EMAC, the Emergency Management Assistant Compact, for cyber incident response. And I'm curious if that came up here in terms of mutual aid as either something that someone might exercise and use and say, or we have an agreement with another state, or in some of the solutions. Thanks.
It did come up. And I think one of the takeaways from this exercise, and I was more with the Massachusetts folks than others, but every different kind of region had different build outs for what they could respond to and provide assistance with other communities. You know, some states have a larger group of cyber response folks versus, you know, a state like Massachusetts that really just have a small cadre of people. And I know that particular side of the sector, for many that have worked in a local or a state jurisdiction, there's not a lot of money on the local and state side for those kinds of jobs. So they tend to be places people start and they, you know, quickly move on. You know, we have a small group of people that stick around, but there's a larger amount, you know, at least in the Massachusetts area, that get scooped up by, you know, private organizations and finish their careers there. So we looked at it. It's something that obviously, you know, if this happened today, we would definitely try to work together on, but every state has different capabilities and not all of them are as strong as others.
One point during the exercise, right, I was sort of floating between all the different rooms, right? So I got snippets of perspective, not a deep perspective. And it was my observation that on the topic of mutual assistance, it was highly varied. And one of the driving functions of that is so mutual assistance is an incredibly important construct for our kind of day-to-day emergency management planning, right? But our day-to-day emergency management planning is broadly based around natural hazards, right? And that is by definition generally geographically constrained. And so when you see a hurricane come down to Florida, you see bucket trucks rolling from California which is easy for the people in California to do because, well, number one, there's a reimbursement mechanism for that called the Stafford Act if it's appropriately enacted. And California is not under the same hazard as Florida is right now. So there's sort of a availability to do that. Plus, we've done a lot of work to make all of this happen, right, in most sectors. One of the challenges with the hurricane is everywhere is that everyone's under similar risk. And that, from my perspective, did put a cooling effect on mutual assistance in this scenario, because even if they weren't having specific impacts on their sector and different things happened at sort of different times, there was concern that they were next. And that kind of breaks some of our mutual assistance models. Just because of the nature of this non-geographically constrained threat. And so while there was definitely some of that happening, and I think it's sort of more regionalized, more local between jurisdictions, you saw that, but like the seeing bucket trucks going across the country was basically not happening.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of turtling that would happen, but I also think there was also a lot of conversations on, would our cyber people here be able to really assist that community who uses completely different software systems, right, technologies, and how well would that work versus a bucket truck going from here to there and reconnecting electricity, at least on a larger scale, is functionally easier to hopefully accomplish versus trying to do something in the cyber sector that we really haven't thought about or built up that plan for yet.
Yeah, that works because for decades we've been working to make it work. We haven't had that experience or impetus on the cyber front. And I saw, again, to quote Rob here, we moved more towards the ruthless prioritization. What bubble of safety can I make, as opposed to how do I make everything good, which I think personally think is a pretty good strategy. I see the mic went over, so good.
Yes, hi. So you mentioned this is a social problem, not a technological one. How can we change behavior of either the sector, the training, the education of cybersecurity professionals or of the sector at large to address this problem? Like, what behavior change are you looking for?
I think it gets back to operating without your critical system. And that's something that it takes a long time to even get people to make that cognitive switch, because the initial response that we get from a lot of our operations groups is, well, we can't. And that's not a good enough answer, right? So I think it starts there, and that's about as far as I've gotten with our groups. I also think that there's a broader national conversation about, and Mark uses this term a lot, a civil defense mindset, where the country needs to begin to get a little bit more prepared to withstand large-scale disasters, where maybe the federal government or maybe even your state isn't necessarily coming to save you, right? But they may be coming to save a certain thing. And that's the sort of flip side of that coin, less organizational, more sort of public mindset.
Building off of what you said, there was something that I am struck by only more recently being with an asset owner, but being in this space for a long time, right? Is that very narrowly focused perspective on the technology and that this is the silver bullet, right? So going to that more civil defense mindset, I was thinking about it this morning, actually, as I was thinking about this panel, which is I can put the alarm system on my house, right? That only solves one threat to the safety of the inhabitants in there, right? We just had a big storm in Virginia. We were without power for 2 days, right? There are a lot of other things and systems that my husband and I realized should have been a little bit more on top of, right? For us to be prepared for that. And we need to get out of this perspective of, which was my hopeful thing, right? Which was, okay, we know that it's not the if, but when. We've moved past that conversation, but we have to move even farther for the resilience perspective, and the constant distraction of cyber this, cyber that doesn't help us address that more holistic resilience picture. I'm not saying we don't have to look at it. I still need to put the alarm system on my house, but there's a lot of other things that we need to do too. And as a business, there is a methodology and a rhythm to that we need to be cognizant of.
So I have a response kind of in 2 points. And Rob brought up the first one, which is one of the things that was an outcome of this exercise that Dr. Irv Lachel and I put out was a thing to return back to the civil defense mindset of thinking, right? And actually, Charlie mentioned that, the Civil Defense Act, there was a time in this country where we were citizens were all mentally prepared for bad things to happen. Like we did a lot of things to deter that. There was a lot of other stuff going on. But at the end of the day, individual citizens had an understanding of their role and responsibility in being ready for this type of activity, right? And so we need to get back to that messaging, because whether it's China in 2027 or China in 2029 or Russia in 2062, it doesn't matter. This type of threat is going to be enduring for quite some time. And we just need to kind of reorient our policy thinking to getting into that kind of headspace. We also, have not had an attack on our homeland at any scale, right? Since Pearl Harbor, right? And that wasn't on the mainland, right? So the challenge here is we are accustomed as a society to having plenty. We are not good at ruthless prioritization. We are not good at understanding there's not enough electrons for everybody. There's not enough natural gas for everybody. There's not enough water for everybody. How do we actually make those decisions about who gets that limited resource was another area where the exercise did push into and ultimately was sort of broken. And everyone fell back on their individual prioritization schema. In some cases, it was literally the operator at the console who made the decision, absent of anything up the stack. And so with a little bit of cheap planning, right, we can do better. Cost effective. Thank you. With a little bit of cost effective planning, we can do better. We can come up with better methodology during peacetime so that we're a little bit better prepared. It won't be perfect, but we'll be better prepared when this actually happens. If we can couple that with making the citizenry or communities kind of at the local level ready to kind of be on their own for 30 days or 45 days or 60 days, we're going to be in a lot better shape as a country on the backside. Because that was actually my hopeful thing. The thing that was good for me is I saw pieces that we were going to make it at the end of this, right? People came together. They were solving the problems. They were solving the problems that weren't just the technical problems, the other problems, and they're delivering goods and services to the people, right? We came together to make it, but we didn't restart the power grid, right? And so we need to, be ready for those types of long duration things, which is just something that in this country we're not mentally ready for, and we don't plan for, and we just got to make that shift. And that's why it's more of a policy and people problem than it is a technology one, because the technology will come along if we have the right guidance and direction. And is that my hook, Bryson?
We can fit a short question from the next.
Okay.
I'll keep it really simple. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, MITRE, for putting together this amazing 15, 16 folks exercise, right? So my question is pretty simple. MITRE did this now, but in a real world scenario, who is the referee? Who's the incident commander? What's the policy in place right now to make it work?
No one's in charge.
Yes, sir.
There's policies, and I'll let you guys all talk. There's policies, there's procedures, there's stuff in place, there's federal government policy, et cetera. It turns out no one's in charge. Charlie's in charge. The local incident managers ended up taking.
I'm on vacation that week.
No, but there's an insight buried in there, and that is that if we wanted to build national scale resilience, we needed to start 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And we haven't done that. So maybe we just need to focus on figuring out these enclaves, figuring out these localities. And then actually Charlie can't be on vacation that week. Sorry.
Denied.
Don't worry, I answer my phone on vacation. But realistically, in every natural disaster we have, there is an incident commander through emergency management or local, state, federal law enforcement. And that's, at the end, who's going to be the kind of key person that's leading the response back and then trying to find all the right people to help us with it. And those are the people that you definitely want to make connections with. Wherever your organization is either based or services, make those connections with emergency management. There'll be somebody there that even just having a conversation and making sure that you each know each other. If something bad happens, it doesn't have to be the full scale cyber attack. It could be something smaller that you're still able to make that phone call and fix and build that relationship.
The thoughts? All right. Well, thank you all for your attention, and hopefully you learned something new today about how we're going to deal with China.
Thank you.